And that's that part. Yeah, I think very, very much. Not only it's driven, something that I like to be involved with the administration. I mean, also the kind of agency that is have the resources and to have the regulatory support to go into this. Job is to investigate, job is to educate and protect with employers, but its job is also to enforce. And that's where the biggest resistance has been, and it continues to be on that front. Challenge all the time. But having said that, just where the changes happen. I think the real issue of climate and the acceptance by the majority of everyone in the country is a very powerful policy challenge and a political reality. And those that don't recognize that we have to respond to this, are going to be in trouble. And so now that we're at this point, and I want to thank the framework for getting together. We look forward to working with you as we implement accountability from the administration and how we're responding. And also as we look forward to the opportunity to be able to craft legislation that codifies that into law with protections and make it equal. And I think the fight around climate, I think, is represented by you. It's a coalition that is going to deal with the climate issue. And prominently in that discussion is the issue of equity and justice. Not separate silos. So we're not fighting climate change and with part of our world and part of our population. So we're fighting climate change with all of our world. Because otherwise they're not going to solve, they're not going to provide remedies. As long as you leave 30 to 40% of the people, this country, out of the equation on the climate change response, and so it's a microcosm. So as we protect workers, as we become more assertive and aggressive and resource the right things to protect and enforce the regulations and the laws that exist to protect workers, and not to be intimidated by the industry who thinks maybe 0.3% less profit by instituting these laws. That should not be our problem, or should it be any other. Possibly do this, my friends, protect your workers. Now, let me talk about the transition. Number one, big protection challenge. How do we make the issue of equity and justice and assistance, worker protections, public health, and the safety of those workers. How do we make that permanent and long lasting? And I think that has to be part of the response. That's why I look forward to working with other organizations on it. It's not that Chairman, we were talking about some tribal vision. Maybe I heard it before, but I never heard it. So he goes, when he's giving a presentation, we want the tribes at the king. Chairman, Vice Chairman, because we want to be at that table. We're not much. So, but also our life experience is different. And, it's not that we're consumed with the underrepresented, the under-resourced, systemic discrimination, and racism. Nothing we're consumed by that. It's real. And as we respond to that, other organizations, particularly on the issue of climate and the environment, we're starting to create an even ground that I don't see in other areas. And starting to see the progress of less and less silence, the progress among mainstream environmental organizations, and not only to recognize the importance of justice and equation, but to get to integrate it what they and to be more represented from other staff. So progress being made. But now the progress and the challenges sit and talk about those correct policies. Let's talk about the content. Because we have fought to get to a point where we can have that. Now the pressure and the challenge, which I look forward to working with you on. That's the content. How are we going to put this? So you might as a microcosm. Sometimes I get really tired of being crocodile tears about these poor farmers. I have been going on historically forever. And so, I go to see people that got over it. They've been exploited, they had to work very cold, they had to fight through pesticides, underrepresented, no health care. So no, crocodile tears. And so thank you for putting this together. Thank you for bringing the groups. It's really important. And GreenLatinos in the United States 50 quinceañeras, I brought 3 daughters. I brought. Okay, I said I'm gonna have brought quinceañeras. Bond and care. Ahí estamos, pero la herida, ahí va. So I said, up to 2006 in California. Says we got this, we got our add to it. Or we could do it just together. And I'm gonna say that we're talking about the connection that we have because it's about family. And it's usually about almost like half more than what we're going forward. We said, it's like family. We eat together, we sing together, we fight. And it's just like it's sad when the family doesn't stay to eat. Maybe my family's different. Pero yo tenía unos primos que they came too much. So I don't know. Anyway, thank you very much.
All right, give the Congress member another round of applause. That was just what we needed this morning, by the way. Okay, so now we're gonna get going with the rest of our programming. And I have also the privilege of presenting it to the stage our very own Juan Roberto Madrid. He is our GreenLatinos Clean Transportation and Energy Policy Advocate for Colorado, and he's gonna get us kicked off with our panel discussion. So a round of applause for Juan.
Thank you all. And welcome everybody. I have the pleasure of welcoming you to the discussion, some distinguished speakers. And I want you all to, as you have questions, jot them down and save them to the end when we get to the Q&A. We'll start out with bringing up my tocayo, Juan Valente, Senior Social Scientist for Climate Vulnerability, Union of Concerned Scientists, and GreenLatinos Board Member. And we also have Adriana Ariano, Manager of Strategic Initiatives for Next Gen America. And Myra Risner, Project Director for Occupational Safety and Health, Farm Worker Justice. So we'll take a quick reminder about those. If you have questions, jot them down. Part one is Juan. I want to just give you a moment to that video shows where we took it that needs
threats to people's lives, psychological effects, that lady was very distraught and distressed. And that underscores the need for solutions that are that cut across all the different sorts of impacts that our communities are facing, and like the congressman said, these things sometimes legislated or treated in isolation as legislative or executive agency silos, but communities experience them simultaneously without regard to those artificial boundaries, and so they have to be treated in that intersectional way in which they are all.
Great, thank you. And then I'd like to offer Myra an opportunity as well to respond to the video.
Yes, that was a very impactful story, and I have seen the video a few times before, but it's still impactful. And I have repeated this statistic several times this summer, probably 500 times, because all of a sudden people are paying more attention and they're asking. But farm workers are 35 times more likely to die than workers in other industries because of the extreme heat. And that's a story that's all too common. This summer, there have been worker deaths in Homestead, Florida. There have been deaths in North Carolina, in California, in the Fresno area, in Yuma, Arizona, which we already talked about. And this is something that's only going to get worse as the climate crisis intensifies. And all these deaths are preventable. We just need the right policies in place.
And then Adriana will give you an opportunity as well.
Yeah, so I think watching this video, it really hits home for me. I think maybe like a lot of people in this room, my father used to work in the fields of the Central Valley in California, which is one of the bread baskets in the United States. And he used to pick strawberries. And this is very backbreaking work. I think Public Citizen estimates that every year 600 to 2,000 people die of extreme heat-related deaths, making it the top 3 killer in the US workplace. So I think in terms of how that relates to our community, I think there's this notion that climate change is someone else's problem. Someone else is going to fix it for us. Someone else needs to step up. But I think, first of all, climate change affects everyone. And I think if there's anyone that should be standing up, raising their hand and saying, this is our issue, it should be Latinos, because Latinos are on the front lines being affected by this. And, you know, it's just something that it's unfortunate looking back through history and thinking that farm workers needed to fight for their rights, fight for better working conditions in the past. And we've made some progress, but it's just sad to think about that as the climate is changing, we're the ones being punished first by it. So I think we all need to remember that this is our issue and we need to make it a priority in our community.
Great, thank you. And then I'll come back with another question for you, Maida. Research shows that if climate warming emissions continue unabated by 2055, half of the 233 U.S. counties with more than 500 agricultural workers will reach or exceed OSHA's high-risk level for heat, a heat index of 105 to 115 during the growing season. Given that migrant and seasonal agricultural workers typically work long hours outdoors, what kind of risks are these workers under? Is it only heat exposure and dehydration, or are there other risks as well?
So we hear a lot about these worker deaths from heat stroke. Heat stroke is the most dangerous of the risks that they're exposed to, but there are many others that don't receive as much attention. For example, the risk of accidents in the workplace increases when the heat is extreme. People lose coordination, it affects their cognition, they have difficulty concentrating. And think about someone 10 or 12 feet up on a ladder picking fruit, and all of a sudden they become dizzy. Or someone with sweaty hands and impaired coordination handling a dangerous tool. These are real risks, and industry is not addressing it because they have largely decided that the state of affairs is normal, but this is not normal. Workers are being affected. People are at higher risk of developing chronic kidney disease from constant dehydration at work. And this is something that we have already seen in Central America. There's an epidemic of chronic kidney disease among young people who don't have the usual risk factors for this. And farm workers and other young workers are dying in their 30s because they are working outside exposed to the heat all the time. So the risks are great, and it's time that policymakers listen to the community, because it's not just farm workers, all outdoor workers are at risk, people in their communities are at risk, and it needs to be addressed.
Thank you. So a real connection between public health and climate change. We'll shift now, and I have a question for Juan. Scientific research, including your own, shows that people of color are more likely to live in hotter neighborhoods that also have worse air quality than white ones, increasing the risk of our communities, increased asthma, cardiovascular, and heat-related illness and death. Can you speak specifically to the issues that our communities, and specifically Latinos, face as the frequency and intensity of higher temperatures and heat waves continue to rise?
Yeah, thank you. Well, across urban and rural environments, as has been shared here, Latinos are facing those impacts, right? The rural environment in outdoor work, Latinos are overrepresented in that sector. People of color in general in the U.S. are overrepresented in that sector of the economy. You're working outdoors, landscaping jobs, farm work, and delivery services, and so on. So Latinos are occupationally exposed, so their health under changing climate is at risk, as she was mentioning, and also their wages could be at risk if workers could not work due to exceeding the threshold for heat index that OSHA has set. And in urban environments, which is closer to research that I've conducted, Latinos live overwhelmingly in cities in the country. Where they're more exposed to higher temperatures because of the urban heat island, because the Latinos typically will live in older neighborhoods with less vegetation, with older housing stock, with less access to an air conditioning unit or the means to pay for its use. And so when you combine that sort of exposure, high temperatures in neighborhoods that have little shade, little access or very limited access to green spaces, then you find that these populations are more exposed and at higher health risks. And then when you also think about that, there are less resources typically available to the average Latino in the US who have access to healthcare, for example, to drive an air-conditioned car to an air-conditioned office, for example, as opposed to riding in the back of a pickup truck or riding a bus or a bike or some other means to get to an outdoor job site. Then you can start seeing this picture of how our populations, our Latino communities are more exposed. And so that requires a response that equitably addresses these impacts that are not just the climate impacts, but are also the structural conditions that have to do with racism, with discrimination, with segregation, and lack of access to good jobs, to job security, to workplace protections and healthcare, and all others, all those sorts of things that are essential for somebody to be able to live a good life that's better protected from climate change.
Great, thank you. And I'm hearing and sensing a clear connection between climate change and public health and health access. And now we have a question for you, Adriana. Latinos are 20% more likely to live in urban heat islands compared to whites. In addition, extreme heat hits low-income neighborhoods harder than middle-class or affluent neighborhoods. Can you speak to these disproportionate effects and how they relate to Latino youth health and well-being? How have you seen day-to-day realities of changing climate impacting civic engagement of Latino youth?
Yeah, so first I wanted to start out with saying that urban heat islands is a direct consequence of redlining from the past. So someone deemed that Black and Latino neighborhoods were not worthy of investment. So that means that over time, there's less tree cover, there's less vegetation, more concrete. So when it's hot outside, our neighborhoods is the hottest place in town. And how that translates to Latino youth specifically, when it's 80 degrees or more outside, Latino and Black youth experience reduced learning compared to whites. So adding one more impediment to already an skewed playing field. In addition to this, in addition to affecting the day-to-day life of young Latinos, it's also affecting mental health as well. So the Lancet, which is a medical journal based from the UK, states that in the entire world of the youth population, 84% are concerned and anxious about climate change. So like, think about that for a sec. I mean, we're anxious about paying the bills, our relationships, our marriage, our family, but like in addition to all that, you know, young people, young Latinos are thinking about, okay, well, how is climate change going to affect my future? What kind of job am I going to have? Where am I going to live? You know, like Latinos, 55% of them live in California, Texas, Florida. All three of those states are prone to extreme weather conditions. So that's the bad stuff. The good news is that because young people think about and kind of have to consider the effects of climate change is a very important issue when it comes to the youth vote in the United States. So let me give you some statistics. 2018 was the highest youth voter turnout for a midterm election. 2020 was the highest youth voter turnout ever. And 2022 was the second highest youth voter turnout for a midterm election after 2018. So, you know, 3 times is not a fluke. That's a pattern. So I think that we need to have hope and be excited that youth really are paying attention to how our politicians and how people are addressing climate change, and they're voting accordingly. So we need to pay attention to the youth vote and remember that, you know, the climate discussion is not just about, well, it's about everyone, including youth as well.
Great, thank you. I have a question for everybody, and we'll see who wants to answer this first. Today we celebrate the 1-year anniversary of the launch of the Latino Climate Justice Framework, as Irene and Mark had mentioned. Why is it important to have policy solutions centered on Latina-specific issues and impacts? How can we utilize the framework to empower our advocacy around extreme heat?
I'm going to start just because I was thinking about this recently. So I think that there's also this notion that Latinos would not benefit from a green economy. And as was discussed earlier, we make up a significant amount of outdoor workers, construction, farm workers, and others. And reading through some statistics, I read that in a green economy, the main benefactors from this would be the construction industry. And because essentially, whether we're retrofitting or building clean infrastructure, it's basically done almost the same way that's done right now. So that means that now Latinos working in construction are going to benefit from this shift towards a green economy. And so at Next Gen America, we focus on providing resources and development opportunities for youth to really train the next generation of leaders. So we're working towards how to build a pipeline between people, young people who want to work in the clean economy, and then the demand that these new jobs are now driving, and kind of finding a link between the two. And I think that's something that's very important. In addition, within the Latino climate justice framework, I think there's this like idea that we need to invest in the communities that are most vulnerable. So to take my home state of California, the Central Valley, I think there was a statistic, 45 to 50 days out of the year, they experience extreme heat. So in response to that, we need to think about, okay, like, well, how can we mitigate that impact, mitigate those risks? Can we provide county enforced heat advisories? So when it gets too hot outside, we say outdoor workers should probably not be working today. And then, after the fact, can we also provide subsidies to make sure that those people are still getting paid for the days that they're not working? So I think these are just some examples of things that could be done under the framework and how people can work together to resolve this.
The Latino Climate Justice Framework centers the social science and the environmental science and the experiences of Latinos that demonstrate that the impacts of the climate crisis are very acute among these communities, right? So from that perspective, as somebody who works for the Union of Concerned Scientists, we are very, very happy and very proud to be able to support in the framework and help now live into it. And to give you an example, one of the to get to the question, right? How can it be used, for example, to make progress on extreme heat burdens on the population? The city of Phoenix, for example, is engaging in a revision of its climate action plan that has a strong heat component, and that has been done through coalition of different folks working to make that as strong as it can be. It centers the use of social vulnerability data to identify the places and the neighborhoods that are more impacted, more exposed to extreme heat, the neighborhoods that have less vegetation canopy, less access to green spaces, the neighborhoods that also have the largest amounts of people of color, people living with low incomes, people without air conditioning, people that have the socio-demographic characteristics that public health knows that are the risk factors for it. Increased illness and death from extreme heat. And what do you do with that information? Well, on that basis, then you start prioritizing resources like increases in tree canopy or painting roofs white, for example, or increasing your public health campaigns before the heat season starts. One of our partners in Phoenix says that if the public health folks wait until it's hot to start doing their campaigns, it's too late. People are already dying by the time that those temperatures are hitting 100, So those are the kinds of things that the framework can help the center, bring in this framework of let's prioritize the areas, the communities that are more vulnerable, and then use the best available social and environmental science together with the experiences of the communities, just like those that were shown here in the video, to bring that point home and create those solutions.
There was a narrative for many years that communities of color did not care that much about the environment. We just didn't have the time for it, right? But we know that's not true. Our communities, whether they are rural, urban, suburban, are more exposed to the effects of climate change. And what the Latino Climate Justice Framework does is it brings strength from unity. It's not a statement by one individual, it's not a statement by one organization, but it's a platform for our communities, for our organizations to coalesce around. When we have that unity, when we have that strength, policymakers have to take notice. And this is why the Latino Climate Justice Framework is so important. It's more than just an organizing tool, but it's a roadmap for where do we need to go from here, and it expresses the priorities of the community.
Great, thank you. I'll open it up to the audience if there's anybody who has questions for our panelists.
So much for all the wonderful wisdom and all sharing experiences. I think you touched on this for a little bit on the importance of bringing our youth to be at the center. I would like to ask how specifically do you think, what I've noticed, we have a very large percentage of youth of color in the area where I work in South Seattle. And as we involve them, we see how important it is for community, for them to have that sense of belonging when we're doing environmental justice work, for them to understand. But it doesn't seem to click the part of the green jobs. Sometimes we feel like, because they're thinking that it's all about restoration, no seeing it beyond that. And so I just wanted to see if you had any experience or words of wisdom on that. How do we make sure that our youth is being centered on all these green job opportunities?
Yeah, great question. So I think first and foremost, there really needs to be like education and awareness like related to this. I think that youth in the country, although they care a lot about the climate, they're not really plugged in terms of like, what does that mean? And like, what are the wins? Who are the actors? How can I benefit from this? You know, like personally. So, you know, kind of celebrating that, you know, the climate accord just came out through the White House, and like that's huge, and that's like a huge win, like for our community, for the climate campaign, and this is one way for you to be plugged in. And in addition to that, when it comes to jobs, yeah, I think there's this sense that, you know, they see it as like, I don't know, you're going to go plant trees or something, but that's not the case at all. I mean, like I was saying, I mean, construction is like the main kind of industry to win in a green campaign. So I think it needs to be kind of marketed different, as these are good paying careers, right? That like you can stay in for the rest of your life. I mean, you know, someone who's just in construction, like let's say they're retrofitting buildings and they're a contractor, like, I mean, do they think that they're part of the climate, you know, change initiative? Probably not, right? But I mean, they are doing something that's really good for the environment, for the community. So I think there just needs to be a sense that like there's so many types of jobs out there that can be related to climate, that is not like seen as like, you know, you're just like some hippie that's like out, you know, in the forest or something like that. And so I think there needs to be just like a change in like, you know, kind of communication and tactic of like, this is a professional development opportunity that is good for the environment, not this is an environmental opportunity that you can maybe turn into a job. So
I worry about that endlessly. I have a 6-year-old and a 10-year-old, and 2 girls, and I think they are going to continue to live in a world that has been ravaged and changed by climate, an economy that has been transformed by COVID and war, and who knows what's around the corner. Not to be all doom and gloom, but to think, what are the prospects for, the prospect of a college education is increasingly narrowing for a lot of people with the cost, right? The prospect of purchasing a home and doing all these new things that are the markers of being middle class or successful in an economic sense. But it makes me think that we need to, continue engaging the youth and giving them something that will help them get ahead in life and deal with these issues.
Rudy Arredondo with Latino Farmers and Ranchers International. I have been working on trying to develop a whereby we are looking in terms of working towards providing a level of for farm workers to get them out of the field before they suffer, damage to their health. One of the problems that we're having is in terms of making sure that the heat issue doesn't get in the way of providing that opportunity for people not getting stroke for both protecting the farmer as well as the farm worker, because they both need to have that information to make sure that they take those farm workers out of the field before they suffer, any kind of bodily harm. And we are looking. I mean, I've been working on this with some of the techie Latino folks, and we haven't been able to come up with somebody who's willing to help us to develop a public project. We need that in order to be able to establish what are some of the issues that need to be resolved before this is given to the more major effort to everyone involved in it. But this is really, really important to us. Thank you.
Briefly, the coalition of Immokalee workers who represents workers in Florida, farm workers in Florida, adopted a heat standard based on science and based on the input from us to take that to the grocers, supermarkets, that they work with, to adopt that. Then when that threshold is exceeded, or that temperature can go maybe 95 or something like that, that triggers protections for workers, mandatory shade, breaks, and also training and all these other things, similar to the things that are contemplated in the Asunción Valdivia Heat Worker Protection Bill.
The enforcement of that particular, the enforcement of that particular protocol, who's overseeing it? Is it Immokalee workers themselves, or how is that being?
The coalition works with these grocers, and they basically, if they don't comply with the worker protections that they advocate for, they boycott them. So they use pressure tactics that have been very, very efficient, because they're not going to do it out, they're going to sell their hearts. I can give you more information later.
Yes, and there's a real need for more government support for not just pilot projects, but having more urgency about establishing regulations that make it mandatory for the employers to protect workers, because we know what they need: shade, rest, water. But without a mandate, these things are not happening. It's good that there are communities and groups that are trying to do this, but we need it for everyone.
And the Asunción Valdivia bill has been introduced over the last 10 years by Congressman Grijalva, right, and others. And it's a little bit beyond the pale that it hasn't passed yet. It's common sense sort of measures, they're not non-partisan or anything like that, but yet we haven't even made progress on that, which is, it's time, it's overdue.
Thank you. Thank you, audience, for those questions. Those are some great points and thoughts. As I hear everything today, I'm thinking about the intersections of public health, mental health, our youth, I'm thinking of workforce development. And I think all of these are tied into the Latino climate justice framework. And I think some of the initiatives that Green Latinos is working on with urban tree canopy greening programs, with Bezos Earth Fund, there's opportunity to address and do some implementation on some of these parts, so that we're looking at public health, we're looking at workforce development, and we're looking at mental health as well. And then looking at using the framework to get some legislative action done. I'd like to thank you all for your time and attention today, and thank a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you for your focus. So, we're going to be transitioning. There's lunch available outside, and we're going to have a lunch and learn session. You're going to be hearing from the wonderful Joan Cato on our Colaborativo 40 project. So if you want to go ahead and line up and grab lunch, and then come right back here, and yeah, we have a little lunch and learn for you.